Okay, welcome everyone. My name is James Kennedy. I'm the CEO at procurementexpress.com. This is the second in our series of 6 webinars as an introduction to procurement best practice with Kala Dikibo of Telso. Procurementexpress.com is a purchase order management solution for SMBs. And if you're on this webinar, you might be a customer, in which case you have access to Kala as a consultant. If you're not, it doesn't matter, you can learn something today. And we also have available a more in-depth sort of online learning portal where you can go deeper on any of the topics today. So I think today we're going to go for 20, 30 minutes. We'll see how it goes. We're going to have a chat about the topic of effective stakeholder engagement. And with that, I'll introduce you to Kala. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. As you said, this is the second of 6 planned webinars, and I'm very excited to be part of it. So today's topic is going to be on effective stakeholder management. Those of you who are able to watch the first webinar, and if you haven't, please do. One of the key themes that came out of that webinar was the role of either finance or procurement working as an internal consultant. And that's namely saying you have good relationships internally with budget holders to understand their requirement, as well as having good relationships outside the business with suppliers and understanding what products and services they offer that are able to meet those requirements. So it's very important that we're able to engage with these stakeholders and can understand who we need to prioritize with and what type of communication we need to have with those stakeholders in order to influence their decisions. And please feel free to ask questions. Either you can raise your hands or just shout. Just go ahead and shout. So fundamentals of stakeholders. What are stakeholders or who are stakeholders? Stakeholders are those individuals or groups who depend on the organization to fulfill their own goals, or who in turn the organization depends. So ultimately, stakeholders are about interests. Right? A stakeholder has an interest in a decision that's likely to be made around a procurement. A stakeholder has an interest in the organization. And in return, the organization has an interest in that individual stakeholder and relies on that stakeholder to carry out their own work and activities in the right way to support the organization. So there's a dependency around interests of both, of all stakeholders. In terms of categories, there are 3 main categories of stakeholders. Internal stakeholders, as the name suggests, these are stakeholders within the organization, different departments, different employees, and so on. Connected stakeholders are stakeholders who sit just outside the business, but have a legal or contractual relationship with the organization. And finally, you have external stakeholders, and these are stakeholders who also sit outside the business, but do not have any contractual relationship with the organization. And we'll briefly run through them individually. Why are stakeholders important? Stakeholders are important because they may seek to influence a decision. If a stakeholder, by definition, has an interest in a particular outcome, they will seek to influence a particular decision around a procurement that it aligns with their own interests. So that's why stakeholders are important to consider. Also, there are public and regulatory pressure on organizations' activities. So all organizations exist within a community. Previously, it used to be just your geographic community, but now it's a global community. And we have to be aware of the interests of the public and how they view our own organizations. Same with regulatory bodies. They have interest in our organization. There are laws, laid down guidelines about how any organization or any individual in an organization should act. And if we contravene any of those regulations, then we go against the interests of the regulatory bodies and we can potentially be sanctioned. Internal stakeholders, just to run through a few of them, as I said, they're all inside the business or inside your organization. So from if you're running a procurement, you'd have the owner or the sponsor. The owner or the sponsor is responsible for approving the procurement to go ahead. They have overall responsibility and accountability for making purchases. Customers, for example, that could be in operations. They will be the employees who will receive the inputs, the components, the spare parts, and need those spare parts to carry out their day-to-day activities. They have an interest in the procurement because they want to know what spare parts and components they're going to be working with. Finance have an interest in the procurement, from budgetary perspective in terms of ensuring that expenditure falls within approved budgetary guidelines. Also in terms of payment terms, what are the payment terms with the supplier? Generally 30 days in advance. You can have suppliers who, because of their bargaining power, insist on payment in advance. Finance will have to approve that to ensure that there's sufficient funds available to pay that supplier in advance prior to receiving the goods and services. Directors, they're also obviously internal stakeholders. Directors have an interest in terms of the overall prosperity of the business. They're interested in the profits of the business. Increasingly, directors are also interested in CSR, corporate social responsibility. So anything in an organization that affects the profitability or impacts on CSR is definitely going to attract the interest of directors. Sales and marketing, their interest is making sure that they understand the features of whatever product or service you sell so that they can capture that in the marketing that they send out. They're also very interested in making sure that any promises they make customers are actually delivered in terms of the products and service that are bought by customers. So they don't want a situation where customers say, marketing said this and I got that, I'm not happy. So sales and marketing will be very interested in that. In terms of connected stakeholders, as I said, connected stakeholders are outside the business, but they have contractual relationships with your organization. So consumers, your end users, the people that buy your products and services, by definition, have a contractual relationship with you. The sales of goods, sales of services legislation governs that relationship. Goods must be fit for purpose, they must be safe, of a reasonable quality, and so on. If they're not, customer can send it back. So that's the contractual relationship. Their interest in your organization is that, if they buy products from you over a long period of time, they want your business to continue, right? So that they can get their supply from you. Suppliers, they have an interest in your organization because potentially they can win contracts from your organization. So they too have the interest of your organization succeeding, because if your organization succeeds, you're going to carry on having contracts that they can tender for and potentially win. Lenders, financial institutions also have an interest with you. They sit outside the organization, but if your organization is funded by debt, they will have loan agreements in place. The financial institutions interested in your organization in that case will be about the financial strength of your organization, the cash flow situation, to satisfy them that you'll be able to obviously pay back the debt. Shareholders depend, you get some shareholders that sit within the organization. You also get shareholders that sit outside the organization, but they are bound to the organization through a shareholders agreement. Shareholders' interest in the business, again, is aligned with directors, the overall prosperity of the business, profitability of the business, and the reputation, the brand, the corporate social responsibility of the business. So anything that affects the long-term interests of the business, shareholders will certainly be interested in that because they want to increase the value of their shareholding as well as potentially get dividends and so on. Okay, just a quick scenario. We've been talking about interest. So here we have a scenario about the difference between what an interest is and a position. So here we have a new finance executive called Peter. He's just been employed by this telecoms company, so he's currently on probation, and he's been asked to go in and renegotiate a contract with a long-standing supplier. Now, obviously, Peter wants to impress because he wants to, get his employment confirmed. So he decides that he's going to go into that negotiation and ask for a 10% reduction. Supplier is quite surprised by this. This is a long-standing supplier that's been working with this telecoms for a number of years. And anytime in the past there had been any need for the supplier to reduce their prices, the buyer would have informed the supplier maybe 6 months in advance to give them notice that, look, there are price pressures. Can we collaborate to see how we can bring the price down? So this was a bit of a change for the supplier to have someone just come in and point blank ask for a 10% reduction. So he was a bit confused, or the supplier was a bit confused. So he then noticed that he hadn't met Peter before. So he asked Peter, look, are you new to the organization? Peter said, yes, I'm new. I've just started and I'm actually on probation. It then dawned on the supplier that actually, maybe the reason this finance executive, Peter, is so upfront and insistent and aggressive about the 10% reduction is because he actually wants to take something tangible back to his employer to demonstrate his worth and get his contract confirmed. So what the supplier then said was, he understands Peter's interest. Peter's interest is taking something tangible back to his employer. His position is a 10% price reduction. So the supplier then thought, right, I can change Peter's position so long as I keep him happy as far as his interest is concerned. So what the supplier did was to, rather than agree to the 10% price reduction, he offered shorter lead times. Now, shorter lead times will mean that the buyer has less need for storage and therefore can drop their inventory costs. So that's something tangible, reduced inventory costs. Peter then recognized, because he can, take something back, which is reduced inventory cost, his interest had been satisfied. So he was quite happy to exchange the initial offer of a 10% price reduction for shorter lead times. Yeah, hopefully that highlights the difference between an interest and a position. Peter's interest was trying to impress his employer through taking something tangible away from the negotiation with the supplier. His position was a 10% reduction. The supplier was still able to satisfy Peter's interest, his motivation, by giving him something tangible to take back, but was able to shift his position and didn't have to give him the 10% reduction, but was able to offer him shorter lead times, which are a lot more favorable to the supplier. And again, as I said, that buttresses the point about interests. When we're looking at stakeholders, we should always be focusing on the reason why and what their motivation is, rather than what they're necessarily saying. Because if we can understand their interest, we can potentially shift what they're saying to something else, so long as it still satisfies their interest. External stakeholders, as I said, this is the third and final category of stakeholders. You have government. They obviously are very interested in every organization in their jurisdiction, paying your taxes, making sure you don't break any regulations. They're very concerned with that. Similar with regulatory bodies, you have environmental groups and various other agencies of government that are very interested in how organizations behave. They don't have contractual arrangements with your organizations, but they're certainly interested in your activities. And if your activities go against government regulations or regulatory body directives, then you're likely to find, they will come down on you. Pressure groups, charities, again, they don't have contractual relationships with your organization, but they certainly have an interest in your organization, depending on the activities. An example could be a modern slavery charity, who are very interested in making sure the welfare of staff is looked after. If it turns out that your organization is employing a supplier that uses, or giving a contract to a supplier that uses modern slavery, all of a sudden these charities will be very interested in your activities. And gone are the days where charities need a lot of resources to get their message across. The power of social media means that a very small charity, if they're not happy with your actions, can simply tweet out a message, and before you know it, you've gone, your organization and your decisions and your activities have gone viral. And that can certainly provide detrimental press, affect your reputation, and so on. So when you're making decisions around procurement decisions, I should say, that have an impact on, charities outside, community, your local community or the global community, you have to take their interest into account when making a decision about whether or not to purchase a particular machinery or not. Power, right? It's a big part with stakeholders. On the one side, we've talked about interest. Power is also very important when it comes to talking about stakeholders. What is power? Power is the ability or the capacity to direct or influence the behavior of others. I'm sure we've all familiar with that term, power. In terms of the types of power and the sources of power, there are a number of different ways in which power can be exerted, and a number of different ways in which we can influence others, stakeholders we're talking about. Legitimate power. Legitimate power comes from authority, right? As a staff of an organization, as an employee of an organization, your employment contract states who you report into. Whoever you report into has legitimate authority to direct your actions whilst you're at work. So that is legitimate power. We've just talked about the government. The government sets laws. They too have legitimate power to force organizations and individuals to act in a certain way. Reward power. Reward power, as the name suggests, derives from someone being able to offer rewards or incentives to influence that other stakeholders' behavior. So you could look at it in the context of a supplier. If you're trying to encourage a supplier to exceed their KPIs by offering incentives such as renewal of their contract, that will affect their actions, or that will influence the way they behave. Expert power, again, it's in the name. Any professional who has a wealth of experience in a particular area, based on that wealth of experience, has the ability to persuade stakeholders to act in a certain way to which they may have not acted in the first place. So, if you have a consultant or a professor of any particular field, they will provide that expert knowledge that will guide someone's actions. Referent power. Now, referent power refers to people who can influence others through charisma, right? Who have the humor, who are funny. A lot of people think they're funny. Some are, some aren't. But can influence others through their sheer character, through their ability to inspire emotion from stakeholders, and through their oratory, their use of words, phrases, and so on. They don't have they're not your manager. They could be your colleague, but they still have, through that relationship that they have with you, they're able to influence your actions. Coercive power, another word for coercive is threat. It's a very effective form of power. If you say to a supplier, look, if you don't improve your performance, we'll cancel the contract, that's likely to get the supplier to act in a certain way. It's probably not the best in terms of inspiring a long-term relationship. If you coerce or you threaten a stakeholder to do something, you're likely to get compliance, but you may not get commitment. And there's a big difference between compliance and commitment. Compliance is someone doing something because they have to. Commitment is people doing something because they want to. And people are a lot likely to put a lot more effort into something that they want to and be more supportive if they're committed. And coercive power doesn't support that. Finally, informational power. We've heard the phrase, information is power. So therefore, it's important, going back to what we said earlier, internal consultants, it's important that we as finance, procurement staff are very knowledgeable about the requirements of budget holders' requirements, as well as suppliers, the offerings that they have. And with our information, we can influence decisions that budget holders made, maybe because we know about minimum order quantities, or maybe because we know about payment terms from a particular supplier. That can affect the way in which a budget holder makes a decision about a procurement. Mapping stakeholders. So, in terms of, we've talked about stakeholders, we've identified the type of stakeholders, we've talked about the interests that stakeholders have. The final part is to map them. In other words, to say, if we are going to run a procurement and we're going to have a number of different stakeholders who are interested in the procurement, how do we prioritize those stakeholders in terms of who we need to give the most engagement to, especially when we have limited resources in terms of our time? So what we have here is a way in which stakeholders can be mapped. They can be mapped through the level of power they have as a stakeholder, and they can be mapped through the interest they have as a stakeholder. And this is the model that is very well known in terms of mapping stakeholders. It's called Mendelow's Model, and it helps us to prioritize which of the stakeholders do we need to give the most time to their interest based on the level of interest they have and the power they have. So where you have a stakeholder that has low interest in a procurement, low power, so you could say admin staff, if you're buying a new piece of machinery, the admin staff may have limited interest in the procurement, and they also have limited power. Those stakeholders, we give minimal effort. We don't need to engage with them so much because their interest in the power is minimal. If we move to the bottom right, if you have a stakeholder who has high interest, but has relatively low power in terms of the ultimate decision around the procurement, then we keep them informed. So you may have someone in operations who, if you're buying a new drill or a new piece of machinery, they're going to be using the machine on a day-to-day. So they're going to have a big interest because they're going to be using it. However, they don't have power in terms of authority to sign off or anything like that. So those stakeholders, we will keep them informed. We'll regularly update them on how the procurement's going, when the new machinery will arrive and so on. But they don't really have any, because they don't have power, they don't really have any say in determining any decisions that are made. On the top left-hand side, we have keep satisfied. Those are stakeholders who have a low interest in procurement, but have high power. Now, earlier I talked about government. Any procurement you do, government will have a relatively low interest in that procurement. If that procurement goes ahead and breaks laws or regulations, all of a sudden the government's interest changes. And because they have power, the power of the law and to enforce the law, you have to keep government authorities and regulatory bodies satisfied. So right throughout the procurement, whilst the government don't have interest, we have to keep all their interest around regulations and laws concerning the procurement on the right side. And finally, you have key players. Key players are stakeholders who have high power and high interest. Now, these are your directors. Again, if you're buying a large piece of machinery, $10 million, for example, directors are going to be concerned about that spend. They're going to be concerned about whether it's going to impact on, is it going to improve their profitability or not, right? They have the authority, they have the power to, to give the final say so as to whether the procurement goes ahead or not, and therefore they're key players. So right throughout the procurement, we need to engage them from a very early stage, at the design stage, when we're doing our specifications and so on. So we carry them along right to the end stage, so that by the end, because they've been carried along and we've captured their interest right throughout the procurement, they're likely to go ahead and approve. If we don't look after the interests of key players throughout the decision-making process of procuring a large piece of machinery, for example, when you get to the final stage to approve it, the director's going to say, well, hang on, I know nothing about this. You haven't kept me informed. You've done everything on your own. No. And that's the end of that procurement. So Mendelow's model helps us prioritize the key stakeholders in terms of what level of interest they have, and as importantly, how much power do they have to influence the decision-making process of the procurement. And it's a very, we've talked about it in the context of procurement. In any walk of life, in any occupation you have, using this model, prioritizing stakeholders in terms of power and interest, and then engaging those stakeholders is a very useful way to use your time and resources in getting the right decisions that you want. I have here a scenario, but I'm not, it stems along the lines of what we've just talked about. So a mining company is buying a large drill for $10 million, and I've listed here all the stakeholders that would be relevant. Pay attention to trade unions. You have some organizations that do have unionized members. If you're buying a new drill, a new piece of machinery, they're going to be very interested, because potentially you may be making some of their members redundant. So again, you'd have to place them on Mendelow's map, decide what level of engagement they need, and potentially your engagement would be about allaying their fears around you're not going to make any redundancies, so they have nothing to worry about, and then you won't get them calling for strikes or withdrawing their labor or anything like that. But you can see through, we've touched on all the different interests, so I'll let you have a think about that. Thank you. And just at that time, we have a question from James.
Yeah, that was really good, Kala. Thanks for that. Now, I'm curious, like, should you document this stuff? Because now, let's say you had the various forms of power there, which I think I could probably more likely use at my next Christmas dinner rather than my company meeting. But is it wise to document these things? Like, if you put these things down as something, you have someone who's got coercive power, or is this just like a mental model? I mean, could you get in trouble for sort of mapping people out as having a certain type of influence? Like, what was the one to do with charisma?
Yeah. So this is so we're looking at it from the stakeholders' point of view. So what we're saying is, so we're looking at it from your point of view and the fact that you've got a number of stakeholders that you're going to be engaging with. And what you're really saying is, and I take your point about coercive, do you really want to put that out there? But the reality is it is a form of power. And, in a lot of cases, it is an effective form of power. And by power, I mean the ability to influence stakeholders. As I said, with coercive power, it's not the best thing to promote a long-term relationship. You're likely to get compliance rather than commitment. But yeah, I do think in terms of a planning model, it's a very good model to use in terms of understanding what the various interests of stakeholders are, prioritizing all the different stakeholders in terms of the power and engaging with them. So your plan, or in this case, procurement plan, does not get disrupted, and you don't have people at the end who are quite powerful blocking any, or, causing a disruption to the procurement itself. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think personally, what I would do is I would bear it in mind. I wouldn't necessarily advertise it, and maybe so, but it's true. I mean, it exists. You can't ignore it, right?
Yeah.
It's just, so you got to think about it. It's not like pretending like it doesn't exist. It's not going to help you. So that's really cool.
Yeah. So no, you wouldn't publicize it. This would be something that would be kept within your either yourself, if you're responsible for the whole decision-making process or driving the process, or your small team, and this would be your strategy around how to engage those suppliers. But like I said, I wouldn't propose coercive, threatening power. I would propose more, use of information, Because as I said, if you can get people, if you can win people over by the argument or through expert power, for example, and gain commitment, then you're more likely to allay their interests and allay their fears, I should say.
Yeah, well, that's great. Let's wrap it up here. We did a short, powerful webinar this week, and I know that we have a more extended version of this available in our training portal, which is available to customers, or we'll extend it to anyone who turned up today. If you want to go deeper, or maybe you feel like some of the members of your team could benefit from having an overview of this sort of stuff, we also have the training available for them. And then as well, if you're a Procurement Express customer, we'd love to. Kala is available to you if you want to go deeper on any of these topics or anything else. So, yeah, thanks very much, Kala. What's coming up next week, or is it our
Yeah, so next,
I think we could.
yeah, we've decided next week we're going to be looking at negotiations or the principles around negotiations. And some of you may or may not be involved in negotiations, but one of the things I want you to think about is negotiations don't always happen, at work, right? We negotiate, we agree on things, in every part of our lives. So I think if you're not directly involved in a negotiation, it's still, some of the stuff we'll talk about will still be very of interest, I should say.
Yeah, I'm thinking of my Christmas dinner again. Thank you very much, Kala. That's excellent.
You're welcome.
Hopefully we'll see you all again next week. And yeah, thanks very much for coming along.